You're listening to Policy Currents, a podcast from the RAND Corporation. I'm Evan Banks. Today is May 19th. Last week, the COVID-19 era policy under Title 42 of the U.S. Code that allowed U.S. officials to quickly turn away migrants from the southern border expired. Leading up to that expiration, we saw large numbers of migrants gathering at different parts of America's nearly 2,000-mile boundary with Mexico. 1,500 U.S. troops were sent to the border for added security. On Monday, I spoke with RAND experts Doug Legore and Shelley Culbertson. Doug Legore is a senior behavioral social scientist at RAND and a lawyer with expertise in immigration and border security. Shelley Culbertson is a senior policy researcher at RAND. She's also the director of the Infrastructure, Immigration, and Security Operations Program, part of the RAND Homeland Security Research Division. Doug is joining us by phone to give us some background on U.S. immigration law and to discuss the shift in policy that we saw happen last week. Doug, thanks for calling in.
Pleasure to be here with you.
We're going to talk to Shelley in a bit about the implications of the Title 42 expiration. But first, can you walk us through how we got to where we are today? And let's just start with the basics. So what is Title 42 and why did it expire?
Title 42 is an emergency provision of the U.S. Code. And what it allows the U.S. to do, what allows the Centers for Disease Control to do, is in an emergency where there is a pandemic like COVID, or there's some other medical or biological emergency situation, it allows the CDC to basically issue an order that closes the borders for reasons of spread or transmission or other reasons. So because it is an emergency provision, it is the statutory language really cannot be used when the emergency dissipates or alleviates. So it would be improper to keep Title 42 in place now that COVID has really reached the stage that it has, or at least that's the CDC's finding.
Okay. Where did Title 42 come from? It wasn't originally a pandemic era policy.
No, Title 42 is part of a series of public safety laws. So both state and federal governments have a number of public safety laws related to health that they can implement when in various emergency situations and non-emergency situations as well. And these go back. These statutes go back decades and decades.
And so this expiration will affect immigrants seeking asylum in the U.S. Can you describe what that process was before Title 42 was invoked and sort of what's needed to claim asylum in the U.S.?
Sure. So asylum is a different statute. Asylum is covered under Title 8. And the asylum law in the United States is based on the United States as being a signatory to the Human Rights Convention. So the Human Rights Convention allows refugees and asylees to leave states or home countries where they've been persecuted or they have a well-founded fear of persecution. And states agree through the Refugee Convention to accept those individuals on that basis and not return them, a process called refoulement, which would be illegal under the treaty. So in order to claim asylum, you have to establish certain things. You have to establish past persecution based on a one of 5 protected grounds, and that is race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So, for example, LGBTQ plus would be a social group under which you could be persecuted and you could avail yourself of protection.
Right.
So, if you establish that you have been persecuted, then you are granted asylum in the United States. If you have not been persecuted in the past, but you have a well-founded fear of persecution, somebody has threatened you, somebody the tides have
If
turned
you've been
politically in
targeted
your
or yeah.
country.
Mhm.
You've been targeted in some way, and you establish that there's a reasonable possibility that you will be persecuted. Then again, that is another way to establish eligibility. Once you've been persecuted, it's a presumed that you have a well-founded fear for future persecution under most circumstances. So that's basically how it works under Title VIII. And you don't have to enter the country legally in order to claim asylum for good reasons, right? If you're
Mhm.
fleeing a country, you probably, or in some cases, you may not have any documents with you. You may not have your
Mhm.
passport. You may not have ID. They may have been confiscated from you. You may have never been issued documents because you're a persecuted individual,
Mhm.
right? So historically, we have not held individuals to a standard where they must be admitted to the United States in order to apply for asylum. That changed when Title 42 came along, because now, as a matter of public health, you couldn't be admitted. So it forced individuals to stay along the southern border who still wanted to apply for asylum, but now could not be processed.
And there was, just to clarify, there was no entry for any individuals seeking asylum in the U.S. under Title 42.
There were some exceptions
Mhm.
for unaccompanied minors, in some other very small exceptions. If you had been trafficked, there was, but by and large, Title 42 covered just about everybody who was trying to apply for asylum.
Okay. Are there like quotas for claiming Title 8, or is it because it's sort of tied into human rights, and then there's no kind of upper limit?
So it depends on whether you're an asylee or a refugee. If you're a refugee, you're claiming persecution or well-founded fear of persecution outside of the United States, not at a point of entry in the United States. So Congress does and can cap those numbers. And you're
Hmm.
processed in the refugee facility, and then you get a document to travel to the United States, at which point you're admitted as a refugee. Asylees do not have a cap because they're already at a point of entry in the United States. And if they're granted, then they're permitted. They're given asylee status and given legal status in the United States. And caps have not been put, generally speaking, on asylum seekers.
There seems to be a perception out there that the legal framework around immigration in America is very like inadequate. And in my own experience with it, it's definitely something of like a patchwork quilt, and it's extremely complicated. Can you talk to that and sort of why this has become such a large, complicated kind of thing that also doesn't seem to work very well, quite frankly.
Yeah. Oh boy, where do I begin? Right. This is one of the nation's more complicated issues, and it has been for a very long time. A lot of factors come into play with respect to immigration. Race comes into play, right? And race relations come into play, and the history of race and structural racism in the country comes into play. But other factors come into play, such as economics, and whether there are periods where we feel, or certain segments of society feel, that the American worker needs to be protected from an influx of workers that may displace that person. And how do you determine that, right? Where's the right balance for that? There are issues where, at the border, certain communities will get flooded, right, and other communities will not. And how do you provide services to not only the immigrants, but the citizens of those communities when these surges happen, right? So these create a lot of political tensions, and immigration is very much a politically driven and always has been a politically driven issue. And I've outlined it in the past as two basic camps: the sort of the rule of law camp that wants all of the rules to be followed to the letter, and the humanitarian camp which wants more discretion with respect to humanitarian concerns. And so there's been a tension for decades and decades between these two groups. And so at some points in our history, our immigration laws get tougher, and at other points they get more humanitarian in nature. And in some cases, in the 1920s, they were outright racist, right? If you were from a Northern European country, you were fine. If you weren't, you were not fine, right? So all of these factors play into the history of immigration in the United States, and all of it kind of makes it a mess. Right? Because we continue to not work through these issues of race and economics in a way that is politically would allow for compromise, but also that is science and evidence based. Because if you look at the science, overall, immigration has always been good for the United States long term, longitudinally. That really has not changed. So it's difficult to sometimes bring the scientific evidence to the forefront when you're dealing with these other very emotional, very politically charged issues that haven't been worked through very competently.
Exactly. Thank you. So now with Title 42 expiring, are we going to return to the status quo of Section 8 asylum admissions, and what has the U.S. government been doing to prepare for this expiration?
So the status quo has somewhat changed. In February, a rule was announced by the Biden administration to make eligibility for asylum at the border more stringent. And basically what the rule created, and it came into effect just before the lifting of Title 42, is that if you try to enter the country unlawfully, or you come to a point of entry and you do not have permission to enter the country, it is presumed you are ineligible for asylum. That is a relatively cosmic shift in how asylum law has been practiced for a very long time, since 1980, really, in the United States. So that presumption of ineligibility now requires individuals to get permission either through an app called CBP One, where they make an appointment with CBP officials at the border to request asylum in a more organized fashion. This is again to prevent a surge and what people framed as chaos. Or they needed to have been granted parole before they left their homeland or the country that they were leaving from to come to the United States. So again, if you enter unlawfully and you try to get asylum, there are some exceptions to this rule. The exceptions were if you were an unaccompanied minor, right? If you had traveled as a family member with somebody who had permission, and if you sought asylum, for example, in a country that you traveled through and were denied, right, that would be an exception to the new rules. Okay. So you can see that the new rule is complicated, and it confused. The early reports are that it confused a lot of people who were at the border wanting to apply for asylum. More so than the normal law, which is can also be quite confusing.
Well, that was going to be my follow-up question: is it realistic to say that they'll have access to the app, or that they'll be granted parole from their country of origin, particularly if they're seeking political asylum? That's sort of like asking for permission to leave from a government that's already oppressing you. It just seems...
Well, you can go to an embassy or a consulate and you can get permission to come to the United States. That does happen. Not everybody gets access to an embassy or consulate, as you know, as you can well imagine. Early reports are that it has been difficult to get an appointment using the app, because the app is only capable of handing out so many appointments. So what it essentially does is it meters the asylum application and asylum applicants in a way that doesn't strain the system too much. That's not unreasonable, right? You only have so many people to adjudicate the asylum claim, right? It doesn't help to overwhelm the system because you want to make sure that each person has their asylum claim heard. But you're not afforded an attorney to apply for asylum. So, my explanation of what it means to undergo persecution or have a well-founded fear, generally isn't explained to anybody. The asylum officer or the immigration judge has to hear the testimony of the individual and fit it into that standard, whether it fits into the standard or it doesn't fit into the standard. So if somebody comes to the United States and says, well, a gang is after me, that simply is not enough. Even if that gang might do something that's persecutory, if it's not related to the 5 protected grounds, if it's related to economic extortion, for example, as
if
horrible
the gang was
as
targeting someone for being a member of the LGBTQ community, then
right, exactly, that would be a claim
ahead of time.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
Okay. Interesting.
And there can be mixed claims, right? Like you can extort people who are marginalized, right? So in some cases, it might be an economic claim, but it might also be a race-based claim or a political opinion claim. But again, you have to have a hearing. And you have to provide people with due process so that they're able to articulate facts, because they can't meet their burden if they can't have an opportunity to articulate these facts. There's just no way to do it otherwise, which makes this process so complicated. It's not an easy adjudication.
Yeah. Does this system, this legal framework, scale with the surges? I'm assuming that it doesn't, is the other.
We've gone from, I think, in the past 5 years or so, from a couple hundred immigration judges to hundreds of 600 immigration judges, I think was last I checked. So the government is attempting to scale. And there's been resources provided to CBP and USCIS, who are key to the adjudicative parts. The immigration judges are in the Department of Justice, not the Department of Homeland Security, so they would get resourced through their appropriations. So you can scale, but we're not very good at predicting and modeling surges. And we're not very good at predicting and modeling when those surges dissipate. I mean, there are some factors, right? If the economy in the Northern Triangle improves, you can pretty much guess that the numbers will fall. There are many social scientists who believe that migration from Mexico could go to zero or very close to zero, because the Mexican economy doesn't, and the Mexican political system is better than it used to be, right? So as all of these complex socioeconomic factors change, so does our opportunity or ability or capability to deal with the asylum and migration issue, right? Whether it has to scale up or scale down. And it's just it's a very complicated, complex challenge for government.
Doug, thanks for joining us on this call. Really appreciate your expertise.
My pleasure, Evan. Anytime. Thanks.
We just heard from Doug about the legal framework that surrounds the Title 42 expiration and about Section 8 asylum cases. And we're going to turn now to Shelley Culbertson, who's joining us in the studio today to continue the conversation about immigration and the expiration of Title 42 and the impact that that's going to have on immigration in this country. Shelley has also done a lot of work on immigration in Europe and in migration globally. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Shelley. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Evan.
In recent years, there's been these surges of migrants, including greater numbers of children and families than we've seen before. Can you speak a little bit to where these surges come from? Who are the type of people that make up these surges, and what they're looking for in the United States?
Yeah. So in the past, a lot of the people who were seeking to cross the border in this way were single adults from Mexico. And in recent years, we've really seen a change in the demographics of who's coming across the border. So instead of being primarily single adults from Mexico, there are larger and larger numbers of families and children coming from the Central American countries, Northern Triangle countries in particular, and a lot of unaccompanied children as well. And so this population is very different, and it also indicates that their motivations for coming might be very different. The economic motivations for migration are still there. The COVID-19 pandemic really had a very hard impact on Latin American economies. Well, right now the U.S. has we have a shortage of workers. There's a lot of need for workers. So there's a push from Central America, and there's a pull from the United States. But in addition to the economic motivations, there are a lot of other reasons why people are migrating. And these really vary widely. A key one is problems with rule of law and gang violence. What's really shocking is looking at rates of civilian deaths per capita across Central America and then comparing that globally, because the gang violence rates in combination with domestic violence mean that civilian death rates in parts of Central America rival those of Middle East war zones. So Syria, Libya, Iraq, etc. We don't think of these places as war zones because it's not a state conflict, but a lot of people are fleeing this terrible violence that they've been exposed to. In addition to conflict and the economic motivations, there are also climate change motivations. So how this has manifested itself is in a couple of ways. So one has been disasters. So Hurricanes Eta and Iota happened a couple of years, and the response, the recovery effort was pretty tepid. So when people's homes are destroyed, communities are destroyed, livelihoods, ability to get work, and so forth, that has served as a motivating factor for people to leave as well.
So, Shelley, what have been the effects of this increased migration to the United States?
Well, there have been a lot of impacts on border communities and some other communities that are hosting migrants. So, I think we've all seen in the news New York City and some of the estimates that they've been making, estimating in the next couple of years they'll spend upwards of $4 billion in shelter, education, healthcare, et cetera, for the migrants. A lot of border communities are quite overwhelmed. They've run out of housing. Healthcare is stretched. Lots of people camping out in the streets. And it can be very challenging for host communities when dealing with a migration influx, even when host communities are very welcoming of the migrants. Having lots of people enter a new community with significant needs can be quite challenging. And we see this in many other cases around the world. So, for instance, the Ukrainian refugees have fled Ukraine, some 8 million of them, and there are many communities in Poland that are really struggling. For example, Warsaw's school population increased 45% after the refugee crisis. How do you find school spaces for all those kids, right? The same thing seems to be happening in our own communities. With the Syrian refugee crisis in the Middle East, we also saw similar pressures on host communities, in particular near borders, where schools became overwhelmed. There would be so much need for school spaces that schools would often have to put in double shifts. There are big demands on healthcare systems, in particular mental health, since people fleeing under these circumstances are often traumatized and so forth. So the circumstances that we're seeing in our own border communities and destination host communities like New York, Denver, Colorado, et cetera, have parallels in these other mass migration situations globally.
Can you describe more of like what we're seeing in those communities in terms of the education systems being stressed, the need for more teachers and more seats in classrooms?
Yeah, at RAND, we did a study on education of undocumented and asylum-seeking children in the U.S., and then also have done some studies on refugee children in the Middle East. And I think there are a number of parallel trends. But to describe to you a little bit about what we found in our study in the U.S. on this population of kids, we tried to model and understand how many such children had crossed the U.S. Southwest borders in fiscal year 2017 through 2019. And what we found was that it was pretty close to 500,000, actually a little bit over 500,000 children had crossed the border.
Okay.
Then not all of them stayed. Some returned. About 500,000 stayed, with 321,000 children enrolling in U.S. public schools. And that's just from those 3 years alone. That doesn't include children who arrived before that or after that. And so what that has meant is that in many cases, children and families are migrating to particular cities or school districts and have led to huge increases in the school population. So the Los Angeles school district and the Houston school district both experience an increase of some 20 to 30,000 children just in those years alone. So these are really big numbers, and to keep the student-teacher ratios the same, those school districts would have had to have hired a couple thousand new teachers. So these are really large numbers that have a lot of spillover effects that we're often not seeing when we're just focusing on what's happening at the border.
Right. And that's just in the education system, too. There's, I'm sure, lots of other effects that RAND needs to study. So those are the effects here in the United States, but there's also economic impact and demographic impacts in the countries that they're leaving as well in Central America. Can you speak to those a bit? Yes.
So imagine a situation where large numbers of your population in prime working age pick up and leave the country. So a migration crisis not only impacts the destination country, but it does the source country as well. So those countries are losing, they're losing their people. They're losing their workforce. It decreases school population. It decreases the skill base that they've got, the tax base. And so mass migration situations really have a lot of upstream and downstream effects that we're often not taking into account, in particular when places that need their people are becoming in some ways hollowed out, losing, significant percentages of population. And that's not just a situation that we're seeing in mass migration in Latin America. We see that in other refugee situations as well. So for example, some quarter of Ukraine has left the country due to the war. Some 2/3 of Syria's population was displaced either internally or externally. So I think that the massive numbers that we're seeing on the U.S. southern border are certainly an American issue, but we're seeing this trend repeated in multiple places around the world. With parallels, and perhaps there's some policy takeaways that these different circumstances can draw upon.
Some of your previous work draws on a situation that was very similar to this that happened in the European Union. Can you describe that situation for us and what European host nations did to respond to the surge in migration?
Yeah. In 2015, there was what the EU called a migration crisis with a lot of refugees from the Middle East and both refugees and economic migrants from sub-Saharan Africa entering the EU borders. I think we all saw images of people getting on boats, very unsafe boats, crossing the Mediterranean and then ending up in the EU. So that situation really has a lot of parallels to, I think, what we're seeing at the U.S. Southwest border as well. So the numbers were pretty large. They had some 3.4 million, what they call them irregular migrants between 2009 and 2017. And then they took a number of steps to decrease the migration, but it had a lot of political impact on the EU. The migration led to support for a number of far right parties, leading to some near misses in elections. It led to questions about labor markets, and it was somewhat costly. It also led to a lot of debates about EU humanitarian values, identity, and so forth. So it was a significant policy challenge. The EU dealt with this in a number of ways. They came up with individual country approaches to accepting asylum seekers. They kept trying but failed to come up with a common asylum approach in a way that almost seems parallel to how our American states and political parties are struggling to come to terms with a common approach on a new set of laws. They use their budgets to support refugee integration in places with in countries where there had been a lot of acceptance of the migrants. Germany, in particular, took a lot of the refugees from the Middle East. They took a number of steps to strengthen their borders. They strengthened Frontex, which is somewhat similar to the U.S. Coast Guard, increased its capacity to intercept boats and turn them back to try to reduce migration. And then the EU also changed the direction of its foreign policy in many ways. It went from having a foreign policy for developing countries that was mainly geared towards supporting EU humanitarian values to switching to using EU resources to stem migration, helping countries along migration paths to reduce crossing of their borders. So the EU took those steps. It did reduce migration, but it also led to multiple discussions about EU identity and how, to the extent to which they were able to both meet their rule of law goals while maintaining humanitarian values.
Were they able to successfully balance those two? They're not like opposing goals, but I guess what I'm asking is sort of, how was all of this resolved? Was there just sort of the surge in migration ended because of socioeconomic factors in the originating nations that no longer existed, so migrants stopped coming to the EU? Or
a lot of the migration to the EU was stopped because of increased border controls, as well as so financial and development. Yeah, it was a mix. But as well as support for the source and transit countries in reducing migration.
I'm curious how American values play into all of this. Obviously, there's a long history of immigration in this country, but the debate is so highly contentious now. What are those values that are driving this debate, and why is it so complicated?
I think these situations are so complex because they're involving so many values and interests and so forth. So on the one hand, enforcing a border is about rule of law, and many people want to view their border as orderly, not chaotic, and as functioning as a border. On the other hand, there are a lot of humanitarian values. People look at the families coming over the border, the children. They want to be able to help. They want to be able to stand by national laws and values of helping refugees and other people in need. There are also financial considerations. It costs a lot of money to support new people who need to adapt to the United States. So they need to have provision of shelter and food. Their children need to be educated. Their healthcare costs. This is quite costly. It also provides a huge strain on host communities when lots of new people enter a new community and the community does not have sufficient infrastructure or resources to take care of it. At the same time, there are also economic opportunities. The United States has long been, as we've had the expression, a nation of immigrants, and immigration has helped really support the American economy. We have a worker shortage and very low unemployment at this point, and there are opportunities. There are some states that have actually proposed trying to offer their own visas so that they can access additional people who can join the workforce. So there are a number of competing interests, and then all of that becomes tied up in various in political rhetoric, which makes it very difficult to solve, in large part because people are weighting these different values or prioritizing their values and interests in different ways.
Looking ahead to what might happen next, is there like a worst case scenario and a best case scenario for how the situation at the border right now is playing out?
I think a key risk that policymakers face when looking at the border is thinking that border security and border policies alone are going to address the migration pressures at the border. They won't. There are causes much bigger than just border policies that impact who wants to come to the United States and how many. As mentioned, there's poverty, violence, climate change, disasters, et cetera, that are all driving migration. Many of which are just out of control of the United States. So a good case scenario is that some of these terrible pressures that are making people want to leave their homes and take these really difficult risks with their children to come to the United States, that some of these pressures would become reduced and people would not need to leave, and there would be a more orderly immigration system with manageable numbers under current policies. A worst case scenario is migration pressures increase to such an extent that the border becomes overwhelmed with political gridlock that makes us unable as a country to develop reasonable policies to manage those migration surges. So I think the worst case scenario is us as a country finding these issues so complex and fraught that we are unable to develop solutions.
Yeah, it certainly seems to be one of the more intractable challenges in American politics, creating a system that's both orderly and serves the needs of the people that it needs to serve. Thanks for your work, Shelley, making one of these intractable challenges perhaps a bit more tractable. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. Shelley, thank you again so much for joining us and for sharing your thoughts and your work.
Thank you very much, Evan.
That's it for this episode of Policy Currents. You can find links to some of the RAND research discussed today in the show notes at rand.org/podcast. We'll see you next week. RAND is a nonprofit institution that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis.